floor is yours.
All right, and since Roger Sutton did the PowerPoint, I don't need to today. And today I'm not going to talk about earthquakes. It's a real joy to be in Christchurch and not talking about earthquakes. Today I really want to talk about the intersection between people and buildings, I guess. Well, then people and buildings and things that happen to that. I'm very grateful if Joanna's still here. Thank you very much. I wrote a little piece for the press in lead up to this meeting, and really I just want to amplify on a couple of thoughts around that, around safe and acceptable risk and things like that. I think that's a conversation as we're coming into recovery that we haven't yet really addressed some of those issues. Leanne spoke to some of that as well around public expectations with expectations around safe, shall we say. What is safe? Safe to what? And the recognition that even after you've done every possible engineering, the best engineering possible, there's going to be some residual risk. And I think there needs to be a really wide conversation around that, because that's all about the rebuilding and what we expect from the built environment, and increasingly, and of course that's in life safety situations, but increasingly that overlaps with economy and city functionality and cityscapes. And I don't think we've done that. So I'd like to talk through some of that, because I think, and I also want to talk with respect to Christchurch, but increasingly from my point of view as a coordinator around some of the research with respect to natural hazards and resilience, then we've got to learn lessons from the experiences in Christchurch and take those to the rest of the country, if not beyond that as well. And so as much as anything, I want to see how some of the lessons in Christchurch can go forward. So we have codes for buildings with respect to earthquake and flooding, etc., etc. A lot of that is geared around life safety, and I think through various processes, particularly playing out here in Christchurch around life risk in the Port Hills, and through the building code, there is inherently some good work being done in that space. What is acceptable, but of course there's that public perception still that we want to be safe. Unfortunately, the word safe gets used without a context to it, and so we need to say safe to what, and what are people, what's society willing to take in terms of risk. People, the conversation, the communication around that needs to improve a lot, because everybody is doing risk management on an everyday, possibly close on an every minute basis, without particularly realising it. And I was reflecting on this the other day, and I thought, well, actually, as everybody's been going through the renewals of their house insurance and deciding, well, how much do they actually need now we're not going to get new for old or total replacement, that's actually risk management. People are managing their economic futures around deciding how much insurance to put on their house. So everybody's doing risk management every day. You're inherently doing that as you drive to this meeting today, and all of the numbers suggest that actually driving to this meeting is probably one of the most risky things you will do today. That's just how it is. But we're not having that discussion. We really have to have that discussion with respect to the rebuild, and we haven't really been having it yet. I think that safety and these expectations of society around codes and what is a satisfactory part of the code, we're rebuilding here, but we're not even haven't even had that conversation yet. And I'm not sure, and I think that's really what Leanne was talking about a little bit at times. There's a whole bunch of people that are not participating yet. I think engineers have traditionally done things for New Zealand in terms of the building code. that's fine, but we're actually just putting the code, even after all the experience in Christchurch, is fundamentally not different. So have we learned anything, or is that saying what happened in Christchurch is okay? Personally, I think, with some very notable exceptions where there was the tragedies for sure, but to be objective, scientific, maybe cold about it, actually the building performance in Christchurch was by and large very, very good, given the levels of ground shaking that occurred. These were extraordinary. These were well beyond code. But it's really dangerous if we look back at what has just happened and expect that to be the new norm, and that's the new standard we're already expecting. So if we look back at that and want to have full protection to those 200% of code level ground shaking, the sort of once in many thousands of years return period, and that's the new norm, then New Zealand will have taken an extraordinarily conservative step, which is out of kilter with lots of the other risks that we face on a daily basis. We know from New Zealand statistics that earthquake, the number of deaths in New Zealand due to earthquake is around about, on an average basis or annual exceedance or life safety, earthquakes are about 100 times less dangerous than driving on the roads. So yes, when it happens, there's this sort of multiple fatality stuff is really, really difficult to deal with, and it gets a lot of attention. But 302 people, I think, died on New Zealand roads last year. So where do we place our mitigation dollars? So I think in the life safety space, I think codes and ideas and stuff are developing along quite well, and there's a reasonable level of consistency in terms of performance and expectations around life safety. Around the economic losses, I think that it's not very good yet. We saw in Wellington recently the earthquakes coming from Cook Strait. They were about 15% of the building code, and the BNZ building, the brand new building, has been shut down for weeks and weeks and weeks because not the structural part of the building, but all of the interior fittings failed. Not all of them, some of them failed, and there was a whole cascade of failures in that space. That's really very, very poor. That's the sort of stuff that shuts down a city in terms of its economic viability going forward and things like that. So that's really been talked about a little bit, but there's at the moment no change to that element of the code. So that's, I think, an area that really does need a lot of attention. In that sort of space, as we're looking here in the Christchurch plan, the city plan, district plan as it's developing, there's all sorts of things that are being mished and mashed and stuff. There's an expectation there about the 1 in 200 year flood as being a tolerable impact around flood issues. So that might be a useful thing to think about. I'm proposing that should be thought about in terms of tsunami as well. It's inundation. Tsunami 1 in 200 years, is that setting some guidance about acceptable and unacceptable? I think that would be a good place to go. As I say, we've recalculated, we've gone back through the hazard model, the earthquake hazard model for Christchurch, and it was really, no matter which way you disassemble it and reassemble it, the code for Christchurch is about the right place, provided we agree that we're looking at a 1 in 500 year event for ordinary residential buildings, which pushes the collapse criteria out there into the 1 in a few thousand years, which is sort of what we had back in February 2011. For schools, we're looking at a 1 in 1,000 year return period for the onset of damage, and then for critical facilities like hospitals, etc., we're looking at 1 in 2,500 year type earthquakes. So when we look at Christchurch Women's Hospital, that's designed for about the level of the ground shaking that we had, and it continued its function, albeit with a few problems around the backup generators. But, that's the minor part of it. So I think some of that stuff's going along quite well. The public, generally, we need to have that conversation as to what is acceptable has to remain pretty static. But often we see with the public, of course, there's value engineering going forward. So as lowest price maximum, lowest price always, and then after the event, there's that it's all of a sudden unacceptable. Well, we've got to have that communication so that that lands and stays in the same space, because that's the only way to progress this robust society, this livable city, all of those things. So I think a lot of the stuff comes down to the ALARP principle, as low as reasonably practical. That's really good. I think those are really good guidance. But as soon as you start down that path, as low as, well, what does low mean? What's reasonable and what's practicable? We do need to put some numerics guidance around some of these things, and I think that's one of the things in the current district plan that certainly needs a lot of attention. So, but to get some numbers in there or some guidance, you have to have the conversation first, and we're not having that conversation yet. So I'd like to just leave it while we've got 5 minutes to go. My colleague and friend Anne Brower is here. She was in the bus on Colombo Street. She can talk. I'd recommend you talk to her about the costs, the medical costs of her medical costs in that bus compared with the costs of fixing the parapets on those unreinforced masonry buildings. And I guess I'll leave you with the parting thought that the current suggestions around earthquake-prone buildings at the moment is giving every homeowner or every building owner far too much time to fix the really worst parts of unreinforced masonry buildings. In Christchurch, there was very little internal collapse. Most of the problem was facades falling into the street. Now, the current policies around unreinforced masonry buildings, it's URM, unreinforced masonry, the whole building, and not the smallest parts. While we do nothing about the facades or have 10 years or 15 years or whatever to do that, there is going to be another earthquake in New Zealand that kills people through facades falling down, when if we'd prioritise better, we could absolutely save lives now if we were to get the low-hanging fruit around some of that unreinforced masonry. The other point I would say, there's something seriously wrong with the understanding of what buildings are. There's a tremendous data set in Christchurch about these old buildings that went through not just 33% of code, they went through 200% of code and often did not fall down. So there's something pretty weird with this idea around 33% of code being unsafe. You've probably heard Roger Sutton talk about that a lot. There's a lot of data in Christchurch that says that the so-called 33% is something completely wrong with that. You can go to the Ward Church in the Seddon earthquake recently. For example, it was 10% of code, said to be. It had a full 100% of code shaking event, and 2 or 3 bricks in the portal fell down. Nothing more. There's something really does need examining around the performance of buildings. It's a very sensitive subject still. It's very fraught. There are very raw feelings here in Christchurch with very good reason. But unless these things are addressed now, we're just not learning any lessons and just putting those back out there into the rest of New Zealand. So leave it there for a few questions or comments. Thank you.
Any questions?
Please.
One over here. Just get the microphone over to you.
Yes. Hello, Kirsten Barnett, Waimakere District Council. I wanted to ask in terms of natural hazards, in terms of the weather events that we've been seeing over the last 10 years,
Right.
which are exceeding some of our 1 in 10s, 1 in 20, 1 in 100 years, including flooding, windstorms and so on. Should there be more actual emphasis placed on hazard prevention in those areas, considering the amount that we're seeing, and what are the forecasts for those sort of events happening in the future?
Sure. I think that it's, in principle, it's a really good idea, and it's the responsibility of the science community such as ourselves to try and keep us to be future focused, not always just having only a response to the most recent event that has just occurred. That's backward looking. Sure, we need to learn from that, but we need to look forward. So as Christchurch has learned, it's not all about earthquake. It's about all sorts of things. Sometimes it's about flood also. But I would like to say that the recent windstorm in Canterbury is thought to be around about 75 or 80% of the 1975 windstorm. So these are not necessarily bigger than we've ever had. And many of the weather events we're seeing have occurred previously. It's a question of the frequency, maybe, of those events, and that's a question that the modelling suggests that they will be more frequent going forward. There's more exposure to those events, so you didn't have the big pivot irrigators and the intensification of land use out there in inland Canterbury valleys in 1975, but the 1975 windstorm was more severe. So I think we've got to keep separate the difference between the frequency and magnitude, the hazard, versus the vulnerability, which is our land use and our intensification of use. So that's where we need to keep this acceptable, tolerable impacts, I suppose, in mind, and a decision about that. We're in science space, we're suggesting you've got to be thinking about a regional or city economy or something. Percentage of that economy has got to be, it's got to be tolerable that there's damage up to a certain level. Beyond that level, then it becomes intolerable and you have loss of function and the area reduces in its resilience. But we've got to have that feeling about what is tolerable. We can't stop things happening. We can never get to the stage of having no damage.